The master of ceremonies pulled Junie Lott up onto the sanctuary platform to say a few words, the way you'd nudge a dog toward a puddle just to watch it flinch, and I felt the whole church settle in to laugh. So I got up out of my pew, crossed the aisle, and sat down at the piano. My name is Theo Mercer. I was 28 that spring, and I tune pianos for a living. I run the shop my father ran before me, Mercer Piano and Player, on Ash Street in Harlow, Washington, a river town where it rains the way other places have weather. I drive to churches and grade schools and funeral homes with a canvas roll of felt and wire and a steel tuning fork in my shirt pocket, and I make old instruments tell the truth again. That's the whole job. You find the note a thing is supposed to be, and you bring the thing back to it, one string at a time, and you don't rush it, and you don't lie about how close you are. I'm single, if that matters, and it never does the way people think it will. There's no villain. Her name was Nora. We met at 19 over a shared practice room and a broken metronome, and she was better than me, genuinely, the kind of better that a scholarship committee can hear from the back of a hall. She made a cut I didn't, and then she made another one, and by the time she was playing second violin on a tour that went through cities I'll only ever see the airports of, my father's hands had started shaking too badly to hold a mute, and somebody had to keep his customers from throwing out 60 pianos they thought were dead. I stayed. She went. We were both right, which is the worst kind of ending because there's nobody to blame and nothing to fix. I'm not bitter about it. I'm just tired in the specific way of a man who learned to hear beauty for a living and then spent his 20s driving it home to other people's houses. So that's who was sitting in the fourth pew of Riverside Congregational Church that night. A tired man who'd come to work. They'd hired me to tune the sanctuary piano ahead of the church's centennial, 100 years on the same bluff over the Sula River, and the big Sunday was coming up fast with a whole program built around it. The talent night was a warm-up, a fundraiser, folding chairs, and a bake sale table, and a sign-up sheet where people had written things like Comedy, Clean, and the Hollis Girls flute duet. I'd finished the piano that afternoon, a 100-year-old story in Clark that somebody's grandmother had donated and nobody had loved since, and I'd stayed for the evening because the pastor asked me to sit near it in case a key went sour under the lights. That's a real thing that happens. Old sanctuaries breathe. A piano that's true at 4 o'clock can go a hair flat by 8 when 100 bodies warm the room. The MC was a man named Dale Furlong. I want to describe him fairly, so I'll just tell you the facts. He sold insurance, he had a blazer the color of a good lawn, and he ran the microphone like a man who'd waited his whole life for one. He had that particular quality of a person who is funniest to himself. Between the flute duet and a boy who did card tricks nobody past the third row could see, Dale kept the crowd warm with little bits, and the little bits kept circling closer to a target the way they do. And I felt the target before I saw it. The way you feel a storm changed the pressure in your ears. Now, folks, Dale said, we got a real Harlow institution back at the sound table tonight. Some of you know her from the night desk down at the Cormorant. Junie Lott, he said the name the way you set down bait. Junie, why don't you come on up here and say a few words for the good people? Tell us about the hotel. I turned around like everybody else. Junie Lott was standing at the back by the soundboard, 30 years old, in a gray cardigan she'd buttoned all the way up like armor, with dark hair pulled back plain and a paperback folded open against her hip. She had the stillness of somebody who had understood the exact temperature of the room and decided a long time ago not to give anybody the satisfaction of watching her flinch. I didn't know any of the rest of it yet. I didn't know she read 3 books a week, or kept a logbook in a hand like copperplate, or could play the instrument I'd spent all day tuning better than anyone who'd touch it that whole centennial. All I knew was what the room told me, and what the room told me was ugly. Because the room did the thing. That shift. That tiny collective lean people make when they think they're about to watch something interesting happen to somebody who can't help it. I have spent my whole life reading rooms. You have to, in my trade. You learn to hear a space before you play in it. And I felt that congregation lean forward as one animal. They knew. That was the part that turned my stomach. Half of Harlow knew that Junie Lott stuttered, knew it badly, knew that asking her to stand up in front of 200 people and speak was like asking a man with a bad knee to run. And Dale Furlong knew it best of all, and he'd done it anyway because a woman's stalled first syllable was, to a certain kind of man with a microphone, free comedy. Come on up, Junie, Dale said, grinning, waving her forward. Don't be shy. She wasn't shy. I could see that even from the fourth pew. She was something much harder and much older than shy. She set her book down on the sound table, and she came up the aisle because the alternative was making a scene about not coming up the aisle, and every step she took the room got quieter and hungrier. And by the time she reached the platform and turned around to face all of us, you could have heard the river through the walls. She opened her mouth, the, her jaw locked. Her hand came up against her collarbone, pressed flat, the way you'd hold a door that somebody was pushing on from the other side. Somebody laughed. Just one person up near the front, a short bark quickly swallowed, but in that silence it was enormous. And I watched it land on her like a slap, and I watched her decide to keep going anyway, which was the bravest thing I'd seen in a year, and I could not stand it. So I got up. I didn't plan it. I want to be honest about that. I'm not a man who plans to be the show. I'm the man who fixes the thing the show sits on. But I'd spent the whole afternoon inside that piano. I knew every voice it had, and I had a thought that wasn't even words, more like a chord, that the problem wasn't Junie. The problem was the silence. The silence was a cliff, and they'd walked her out onto it, and I happened to know how to build a floor under a person out of sound. I crossed the aisle. Dale's grin flickered. This wasn't in his bit. I sat down on the bench of the 100-year-old Story and Clark, and I put my hands on the keys I'd trued myself 6 hours before, and I began to play. Quiet. Nothing fancy, just a slow, open thing in the key of C, chords that breathed in and out under her like tide, the kind of thing you'd play so a room forgets to hold its breath. Junie looked over at me. I'll never forget the look. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. It was suspicion, the flat-braced suspicion of a person who has learned that when someone steps toward you in public, it is usually to make it worse. I met her eyes and I did the only thing I could think of, which was to keep the tempo soft and steady and nod at her. Once, like a man counting a singer in. Ride it, I was trying to say. I've got a floor under you now, take your time. Nobody's clock is running but mine, and I've got all night. And she did. The hotel, she said, and this time the word came out riding the top of a chord, landing on the beat like it belonged there, and it did belong there, is 104 years old. Breath. I moved the harmony under the breath, so the pause sounded like music instead of like failure. 4 years older than the church. A ripple went through the room, but it had changed shape. So when you sing your hymns on Sunday, she said, slow, deliberate, every stalled consonant a rest in a measure I was writing to fit her, remember the river was here first, and the river doesn't rush. She stopped. I let the chord resolve, and in the space after it, before anyone knew what to do, she looked out at all of us with something almost like a dare, and she said, plain and clear on the far side of the hardest sentence, thank you for having me. I don't think Dale Furlong understood what had happened. I'm not sure the room did. But something had turned, the lean had broken. You could feel it break, the way you feel a fever break, that specific give in the air. A few people clapped, and then more of them, and it wasn't the cruel clapping of people who'd gotten their show. It was the confused, relieved clapping of people who'd come expecting to laugh at someone and had accidentally watched her win. Junie came down off the platform. She didn't look at me. She walked back to the sound table, picked up her paperback, sat down, and opened it to her place like nothing had happened. And I understood, watching her, that not looking at me was the most careful thing she could possibly do, because in a town that had already decided what she was, being rescued in public by a man was just a different kind of story to be told about her, and she wasn't going to hand anyone that one either. I took my hands off the keys. Dale said something into the microphone to move things along, and I sat on that bench for a second longer than I needed to, with my father's steel tuning fork a small cold weight against my chest in my shirt pocket, thinking that I had come to Riverside Congregational to make an old piano tell the truth, and had ended up doing the same thing for a woman I'd never met. The tuning fork, I should tell you about, because it matters later, and because it was the only thing of my father's I carried every day. It's a plain A440 fork, steel gone dull with 40 years of thumbs, and my dad used to say it was the one honest thing in any room. You strike it on your knee, and it gives you the note that A is supposed to be. 440 vibrations a second, no opinion about it. The same in a cathedral or a trailer. And then you tune everything else to that one true thing. The world's out of tune, Theo, he'd say, and it doesn't know it and it'll fight you about it, but the fork doesn't argue. The fork just is. He died with it in his shirt pocket. I moved it to mine. I don't strike it to show off. I strike it when I need to remember what true sounds like. I struck it quietly against my knee, sitting on that bench while Dale Furlong introduced a barbershop quartet. Nobody heard it but me. That was fine, it was for me. 2 days later, I had to go to the Cormorant. I want to be clear that I didn't invent a reason. I've heard men dress up wanting to see a woman again as fate, and it's a lie people tell to make wanting sound like being chosen. What actually happened is duller and truer. The Cormorant Hotel, 4 stories of river-damp brick on the low bank, a green copper cornice, a lobby that hadn't been updated since Eisenhower and was all the better for it, had an upright piano in the back parlor the manager wanted looked at before the centennial, because the church had booked overflow guests and somebody thought a working piano said historic charm instead of we can't afford to heat the whole floor. The manager, a harried man named Petrie, left me a message. "Come by after 8, he said. The night clerk will let you in. We don't like the tuning racket during check-in." The night clerk. I knew who the night clerk was. I got there at 9 in the rain, because it was always raining down on the low bank where the fog came up off the Sula like the river was breathing. The lobby was empty and gold-lit and smelled of old carpet and radiator dust, and under that faintly of coffee. And behind the front desk, under a banker's lamp with a green glass shade, sat Junie Lott with a book propped against the bell and a leather-bound ledger open in front of her, writing in it in a hand so neat it looked printed. She looked up when the door chimed. She saw it was me. Something crossed her face, not quite alarm, more like the bracing a person does at the top of a hill they've slid down before, and then it smoothed over into the flat, guarded stillness I'd seen at the church. "Petrie sent me," I said, "about the parlor piano. I'm Theo. Mercer." I stopped there because I'd almost said something about the church and I could feel how badly that would land. The man reminding her he'd rescued her, collecting on it, so I just said, "I do pianos. I'm sorry it's late. This is the only shift the manager would let me make noise on." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached under the desk and she took out a second ledger. No, not a ledger, a repair logbook, my own kind of book, leather-cornered, the pages ruled. Except it wasn't mine, it was hers, a spare, and she uncapped a pen and wrote something and turned it around on the desk to face me. "Pianos in the back parlor," it said in that copper-plate hand, "through the double doors. It's terrible. I'm sorry in advance." I read it. I looked up at her. She was watching me with a kind of held breath, and I realized this was a test, not of me exactly, but of what kind of man I was going to be about the fact that she'd rather write to me than talk. A lot of people, faced with that book turned around on the desk, would have said something kind and terrible. "Oh, you can just tell me." Or worse, would have talked louder and slower, the way people do at someone they've decided is slow, as though a stutter lived in the ears. I didn't do either. I took the pen off the desk. I asked first, held it up, eyebrows raised, and she nodded, and I wrote underneath her line in my own bookhand, which is worse than hers. "Terrible how, sticky, sour, or dead?" And I turned it back around. She read it, and something happened in her face that I would spend the next several weeks trying to earn again. A small involuntary thing at the corner of her mouth, there and gone, the ghost of a person who was not used to being answered in her own language. She took the pen back. "Sour," she wrote. "Middle's swimming, 2 notes near the top don't play at all, and it smells like the river got into it, which it did, in '09, but it was my father's, so. I looked at that so for a second, a whole biography in a so. "He was the night man here for 30 years, she wrote when she saw me reading, before me. He'd play it at 3 in the morning when there was no one to bother. I kept his shift and his piano." "Then let's go listen to what the river did to it," I said out loud, because I'd decided something, that I would talk to her the normal amount, in a normal voice, and let her answer however she wanted, and that I would never once make the size of the gap between those two things into a thing. She could write. I could talk. We'd meet in the middle of the desk. "Bring the lamp if you can. Back parlors are always dark and always lying about it." She almost smiled again. She brought the lamp. The parlor piano was an old upright, a Baldwin from before the war, tall and black, with a candle shelf front and brass sconces gone green, and Junie had been kind calling it terrible because it was worse than terrible. It was heartbroken. The '09 flood had come up into the soundboard and left a tide line you could still see, and the felts had swollen and dried a dozen times until they'd forgotten their shape. And when I sat down and ran a scale, it sounded like a man trying to sing with a cold. But under the cold, and this is the thing only my trade lets you hear, under the cold it had a good frame. Somebody had built it honestly a long time ago. It wanted to come back. Most of them want to come back. That's the part of the job that isn't mechanical. Junie stood by with the lamp while I opened it up and started to read it with my hands, and after a while, without either of us deciding to, we fell into a rhythm. I'd say what I found out loud and she'd write back, and between the two of us we had a whole conversation with only half of it spoken. "Your dampers are shot," I said. "Everything's shot," she wrote. "It's a hotel piano in a flood town. It has low expectations." She paused, then added, "We have that in common." I laughed. It surprised me how much I laughed, alone in a cold parlor at 10 at night, with a woman handing me index cards of dry wit across a candle shelf. "You're funnier on paper than most people are with their whole faces," I said. "That's the idea," she wrote. "On paper, nobody rushes me." She capped the pen, uncapped it. "On paper, I don't stutter." She looked at me when I read that one, straight on, testing again. See how you handle the actual fact of it, right out on the table. And I understood that she decided to say the true thing first, before I could tiptoe around it, the way she'd walked up that aisle rather than make a scene about not walking up it. She was a person who preferred to hand you the hard thing herself so you couldn't corner her with it. I noticed at the church you don't stutter when you sing either, I said. It was a guess. I hadn't heard her sing, but I'd heard her land those words on the beats I gave her, and I'd been thinking about it for 2 days. She went still. Then she wrote slow. How did you know that? Because you weren't fighting the words when I put a floor under them, I said. You were riding them. People who stutter mostly don't when there's a rhythm to hang on. Singers, some of them, it's why the church thing worked. It wasn't me. I just gave you a beat and got out of the way. She read that. She read it twice. And then she did something she hadn't done yet, which was pick up the pen and hold it without writing, just holding it, looking at the drowned old Baldwin. And when she finally wrote, it was only 3 words. Nobody ever noticed, it said. I've thought about those 3 words a great deal since. Nobody ever noticed. A whole town, 30 years, and no one had bothered to learn that there was a version of her that didn't stumble, and it lived in music, and all you had to do to reach it was give her a rhythm and shut up. They'd looked at Junie Lott and heard a stall, and decided the stall was the whole song. It was late. I'd done what I could do that night, which was diagnose and not much else. The Baldwin needed a shop in a month, and I told her so, and I told her the honest number, which was more than a hotel would ever pay, and she nodded like she'd expected exactly that. On my way out, she made me coffee I hadn't asked for. She poured it into 2 mugs and set them on the desk, and I noticed them because I noticed things, the way my father taught me to notice the wear pattern on a hammer to know how a man played. Her mug was heavy diner porcelain gone brown inside, with Cormorant Hotel in a faded gold arc and a hairline crack you could feel with a thumb. A mug the hotel had ordered a case of in 1970 and never replaced. Mine was nothing like it. Mine was a squat orange thing with a chip out of the rim and the words "World's Okayest Fisherman" printed on the side in a font that had given up. They did not match. They did not come within a country of matching. That's a good mug, I said, turning the fisherman toward me. She took the logbook and wrote, it was my father's. He said the guest gets the ugly one, because the ugly one's already been through something and won't judge you. She set the pen down. Then she picked it back up and added drier than the coffee. He also said okayest was aiming too high. I drank the whole cup standing at that desk in the green lamplight, in no hurry to get back out into the rain. And when I finally left, I realized I had not tuned anything, not really, and had somehow done the most important part of the job anyway, which is to find out what a thing is supposed to sound like before you touch it. I couldn't take money from the hotel for that piano, because the hotel wasn't going to spend it, and I couldn't leave the piano drowning in the parlor, because I'd already met it, and you can't unmeet a thing you can fix. So I did what my father would have called good business and what my accountant would call the reason I drive a truck with 200,000 miles on it. I told Petrie I'd take the Baldwin to my shop and get it playing at cost, and then I quietly forgot to send a bill. I told myself it was a slow month. It was a slow month. It was also, if I'm honest, that I'd found a piano and a person who both got quiet in the same way, and I wanted to be near the sound of it. We moved the upright on a Tuesday, in the rain, on a dolly and a ramp and my own bad back, and Junie came out from behind the desk to help, even though she wasn't strong enough to do more than steady it, and steadying it was the whole point. She wouldn't let it go down the ramp without her hand on it. When it was strapped in the truck, she stood there in the drizzle, looking at the empty square of cleaner carpet, where it had been for 30 years, and she didn't write anything, and she didn't say anything, and I didn't make her. At the shop, over the next 3 weeks, I took her father's piano apart and put it back together true. I want to tell you about the middle C, because everything came down to the middle C eventually, and it started as nothing, as the kind of small maddening fault that any tuner will recognize. The middle C key stuck. Not every time. You'd play it and it would ring fine for a day, and then some change in the weather, some swelling of old wood, and the key would go down and stay down a half beat too long, the note hanging in the air after your finger had left, a small dishonest sustain. I pulled the action, I eased the key, I sanded the pin, I did everything you do. It would behave for 3 days and then stick again. I started to take it personally. A piano tuner's whole religion is that a note should stop when you tell it to, and this one kept holding on, like it had something it wasn't finished saying. Your father's C won't quit, I told Junie. I'd started stopping by the Cormorant on my way home some nights, just to report, and it had become a thing we did. The green lamp, the 2 ugly mugs, the two logbooks open on the desk between us like a chessboard. Stubbornness runs in the wood, she wrote. He was the same. She thought and added, he'd play that C over and over some nights. Just the one note. My mother used to say he was tuning the whole house to it. She capped the pen. He wasn't a tuner. He couldn't fix anything. But he could listen to a thing until it told him what it wanted. I read that, and I looked at her across the two mugs, and I said, that's the whole job. That's my entire job, described by a man who couldn't fix anything. She wrote, he would have liked you. And then, because she was who she was, she immediately took it back the only way she could, by adding, he liked almost nobody, so don't get proud. The logbook was the thing. Writing gave her the one thing the world had never given her, which was time. On paper, she was the fastest person I have ever known. She'd fire back a line before I'd finished reading her last one, funny in a way that had teeth. The town had spent 30 years mistaking the speed of her mouth for the speed of her mind, and here across a hotel desk at midnight was the actual speed of her mind, and it was terrifying. She'd read everything. She went through 3 books a week the way I went through coffee, and when I mentioned I'd never finished a novel my father left me, she took it out of my hands and gave it back in 5 days, with a card telling me exactly where I'd been wrong to quit. You read for a living, too, she wrote once. You just call it listening. How do you figure? You walk into a room and you can hear what's out of true in it. She was writing fast now, warmed up. Everybody's got a note they're supposed to be. Most of us go our whole lives a half step flat and never know it, and it makes us mean, and we don't know why. She stopped. Reread it. Then, drier. You should charge more. I laughed so loud the night porter looked over. It was the first time I'd laughed like that since before my father got sick, and it startled me. The size of it, the way a note startles you when a piano you thought was dead suddenly rings. Somewhere in there, I stopped thinking of her as the woman I'd played for at the church, and started thinking of her as Junie, the smartest person in Harlow, who happened to be filed under simple by a town too lazy to read her handwriting. The rain drive was in the 4th week. There was a house downriver, past the old cannery, where a woman named Estelle Vos had died in the winter, and her nephew was clearing the place to sell. And he'd called me because there was a piano in the front parlor, and the parlor had flooded when the Sula came up in March, and he wanted to know if it was worth anything or whether he should just have the guys take it to the dump. I hate that phrase. Take it to the dump. I've saved more instruments from the dump than I've sold new, and every one of them had a whole family's Christmases inside it that the family had stopped being able to hear. I told him I'd come look before he called any guys, and then, standing at the cormorant desk that night telling Junie about it, I heard myself say, you should come. It's your night off. You'll want to see this one before it's gone. She looked at me a long moment, then she wrote, why? It was a fair question, and it deserved a true answer, so I gave it one. Because you're the only person I know who'll be quiet about it the right way, I said. And because I'm tired of being the only person in this town who thinks a drowned piano is worth a drive in the rain. She was quiet. Then she reached under the desk and she took out a paperback. She was always mid-book. And she set it on the counter as a way of saying, yes, I'll need something to read while you fuss. And she wrote, one word, I'll drive. You get lost. You told me you get lost. I had told her that. She'd been listening at the corner of the desk, closer than she let on. The Voss house was 3 miles down a road the fog owned, and Junie drove my truck, like she'd been born with 200,000 miles under her, and neither of us said much, and it was the best kind of not talking, the kind where the quiet is full instead of empty. The parlor smelled of river and mildew and the specific green sadness of a house nobody lives in. And the piano, a little parlor grand, a baby grand really, French polished once, now bloomed white with damp, sat in the gray light under a window with a tide line on the wall behind it, and it was, I could tell from the door, gone. Soundboard cracked clean through. Pin block rotted. It was the one you couldn't save, and I'd known that on the phone, and I'd come anyway because you come anyway, out of respect, the way you'd go to a viewing. This one's gone, I said, running my hand along the cracked board. I'm sorry. I hoped I was wrong. Junie set her book down on the bench. She lifted the fallboard, the cover over the keys, and looked at the yellowed keys a while, and then, before I understood what she was doing, she sat down and played it. I have to tell you what that was like, because it changed the shape of everything after. The piano was ruined. Half the notes were dead, the ones that spoke were sour, the soundboard couldn't hold a tone. It was the worst instrument in the county. And Junie Lott sat down at it in a dead woman's flooded parlor and played something I didn't know, something slow and turning and heart-stoppingly simple, a melody that climbed and came home. And she played it through all the dead notes as if she could hear the piano the instrument used to be underneath the wreck it had become. She played around the dead keys, She voiced the sour ones soft so they'd forgive themselves. She made that drowned little grand sound for 90 seconds, like the last true thing in the world. And she didn't stutter. Of course she didn't. There are no consonants in a melody. There is nothing to trip on. There was just Junie, out loud, finally, saying the thing she'd never been able to say at a microphone, and it was so far past beautiful that I had to look at the tide line on the wall so I wouldn't do something undignified in a stranger's parlor. When she stopped, the silence came back into the room like water. "What was that?" I said. My voice didn't come out right. She looked at her hands on the dead keys. She didn't reach for the logbook. She just looked at her hands for a long time. And then she said out loud, slow, careful, riding a rhythm only she could hear, "Something I wrote a long time ago. Breath, when I was a girl. Breath before I gave it away." I didn't understand that last part yet. Before I gave it away. I filed it the way she filed things about me, and I said gently, because it was all I had, "You should never have given anything away, Junie. You play like the piano's telling the truth for the first time." She stood up and closed the fallboard, soft the way you'd close a door on a sleeping child. "They wouldn't have believed it was mine," she said. And she picked up her book, and she walked out to the truck, and she drove us home through the fog, and I sat in the passenger seat of my own truck, understanding that I had just heard something I wasn't going to be able to unhear, and not knowing yet that it was going to break both our hearts before it fixed them. The centennial was 10 days out, and I had one more job at the church. A final touch-up of the sanctuary story and Clark, plus the pastor wanted me there for the big choir rehearsal in case the piano drifted under the lights. So I went on a Thursday night with my roll of felt and my father's fork in my pocket, and I sat in a back pew while the Riverside Congregational Choir ran the program, and that's where the floor came out from under me. The heart of the whole centennial, it turned out, was a hymn. I'd half known this. You couldn't be in Harlow that spring without hearing about the centennial hymn, but I hadn't paid attention, the way you don't pay attention to the water you drink. It was called Morning on the Water, and it was, the pastor explained to a visiting reporter in the front pew while the choir warmed up, the soul of this church, the song this whole town was raised on. 100 years on the bluff, and this was the anthem they'd sing to close the service on Sunday, the whole congregation on its feet, and it had been written. The pastor said this with real reverence, and Dale Furlong, standing at his elbow in his good lawn blazer, nodded along like a man taking credit by proximity. It had been written decades ago by the church's beloved late choirmaster, Silas Wren. "A giant," the pastor said, "taught half this town at Scales. Gone 15 years now, God rest him, he left us this." And then the choir sang it. I knew it from the second bar. I knew it in my body before I knew it in my head, the way you recognize a voice through a wall. It was the tune Junie Lott had played on a dead piano in a dead woman's flooded parlor, the same climb, the same turn. The same heartbreaking coming home in the last phrase, the one that had made me stare at a tide line so I wouldn't embarrass myself. Note for note, there was no mistaking it, and there was no coincidence that could hold it. The town's 100-year hymn, the soul of the church, Silas Wren's great gift, was the something Junie wrote a long time ago when she was a girl, before she gave it away. I sat in that back pew and did not move for the length of the whole hymn. And I heard, under the choir, under the organ, a thing nobody else in that room could hear, which was the sound of a woman being erased in real time by the very people who loved the things she'd made. They stood for it. They wept a little at the last phrase. I saw an old man in the third row take his glasses off, every one of them crying over a stuttering woman's heart while calling it a dead man's name. I didn't say anything to anyone. What was there to say, and to whom, and with what proof? I finished my touch-up. I drove home in the rain, and I went into my shop, where her father's Baldwin stood half-tuned under the work light, and I decided I was finally going to fix that middle C if it took me all night, because I couldn't fix the other thing, and a man has to fix what's in front of him. The middle C had been sticking for 4 weeks. I'd eased it and sanded it and cursed it. That night, I did the thing I should have done at the start, which is stop treating the symptom and take the whole action out, all 88 hammers on their rail, and go down into the guts of the instrument with a light, into the felted dark where the strings anchor and the dust of 30 years' lives. And down in there, wedged up behind the middle of the keyboard where the C hammer traveled, exactly where it would foul the key on a damp day, exactly where a swelling would make it stick, was paper. Folded paper, a lot of it. Soft with age, furred at the creases, jammed up into the works of the piano the way you'd hide something in the one place nobody looks because nobody but a tuner ever goes there, and a tuner only goes there when a thing won't quit. I worked it out with 2 fingers, careful, the way you free a bird from a fence, and I unfolded it on my workbench under the light, and I stopped breathing. It was music. Hand-copied music, staff paper gone the color of weak tea, the notes drawn in pencil by a hand that was careful and young and not yet good at drawing notes. You could see where a child had pressed too hard and torn the paper, making a clef. And at the top, in that same careful child's hand, in pencil worn nearly to nothing, "Morning on the Water." And under the title, smaller, for Mr. Wren's choir. And under that, smaller still, the way you'd sign something you weren't sure you were allowed to sign, Junie Lott, age 12. I stood at my workbench in a cold shop at midnight, and I read the melody off the page, and it was hers, all of it, the climb and the turn and the coming home, drawn in pencil by a 12-year-old girl who'd pressed too hard on the clefs. And I understood the whole thing at once, the way you understand a chord. That her father had known, that her father had taken the original and hidden it in the belly of his own piano where it would be safe, and that the piano had been trying to tell me for a month, holding that one note a half beat too long, unwilling to let go of the thing it was keeping. Before I gave it away, they wouldn't have believed it was mine. Nobody ever noticed. I drove to the Cormorant. It was 1 in the morning. I know how that looks, and I didn't care. She was behind the desk under the green lamp with a book, and she saw my face through the glass before I even got the door open. And she went very still, the stillness of a person who has been waiting years for someone to walk in with exactly this expression. I put the folded pages on the desk between the two mugs. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust my voice. She looked at them. She didn't touch them, and after a long time she reached for the logbook, the way she reached for it when the thing was too big for her mouth and her hand was shaking, and she wrote one line and turned it around. "Where did you find them?" it said. "In your father's piano," I said. "Behind the middle C, that's why it wouldn't quit. He hid them where only somebody who loved the thing would ever look." She read that, and then Junie Lott, who never let a room see her flinch, put her hand flat over her mouth and pressed hard, the way she'd pressed her collarbone at the church, holding a door against something pushing from the other side. And this time the door didn't hold. She cried the way people cry who have taught themselves not to, quietly and with great inconvenience, angry at her own eyes. I came around the desk, and I did not touch her, because touching her right then would have been about me, about needing to feel useful, and she deserved better than a man's need. I just stood near, the way you stand near a piano you're about to open, and waited, and after a while she pulled the logbook to her and told me the whole thing, half on paper and half out loud. She'd written it at 12. Silas Wren was her teacher. The choir master, yes, but before that just the one adult in Harlow who'd noticed that the stuttering Lott girl, who couldn't get a sentence out at the front of a classroom, could sit at a piano and make it weep, and who'd taken her on for free on Tuesday afternoons and taught her everything he knew, which was a lot. She loved him. I want to be clear that she loved him because the story is uglier and truer for it. She'd written "Morning on the Water" for his choir, as a gift, a 12-year-old's gift to the man who'd given her the one room in her life where her mouth didn't matter. She'd brought it to him in pencil on staff paper she'd pressed too hard on, and Wren had played it and gone quiet, and then he'd told her the truth, which he'd meant, she thought, as a kindness. That it was beautiful, that it was better than beautiful, and that no one, not the choir, not the deacons, not the town, would ever believe that the Lott girl who couldn't order at the diner without her mother had written it. That if her name went on it, they'd assume she'd copied it, or that Wren had written it and pitied her onto the credit, and the whispering would follow her the rest of her life, and worst of all, they'd stop hearing the song and start hearing the gossip, and the song would die of it. But that if his name went on it, the respected choremaster's, the song would live. It would be sung. It would outlast all of them. He said I could give the town a song, she said, or I could give it my name, not both. She turned a page in the logbook, though there was nothing on it, just to have something to do with her hands. I was 12. I picked the song. "That's not a choice," I said. My voice was low and it was not steady. A grown man made a 12-year-old choose between herself and her own gift and called it wisdom. She wrote he wasn't cruel, he was right, and it kills me that he was right. She looked up. "It got sung, Theo. Every Sunday for 15 years. The whole town sings the thing I made. They just sing it to a dead man." She almost smiled, and it was the worst smile I ever saw. I got what I wanted. It lived. Her father was the only other soul who'd known. He'd been furious, not at Wren, who he understood, but at the shape of a world that made his daughter hide her own light in a choremaster's coat pocket. He couldn't fix it. He couldn't fix anything. She'd told me that the first night he could only listen to a thing until it told him what it wanted. So he'd done the one thing he could. He'd taken her original, the pencil pages, age 12, pressed too hard on the clefs, and he'd hidden them in the guts of his own piano, behind the middle C, where he played the same note over and over some nights, while my mother said he was tuning the whole house to it. He wasn't tuning the house, he was sitting guard over his daughter's name. I stood in that gold lobby at 1:30 in the morning, and I felt a fury with no one to spend itself on, because everyone who'd wronged her had done it out of love or good sense, and half of them were dead. There was no villain. There's never a villain in the stories that actually ruin people. There's just a town that decided a woman was simple and never checked, and a good teacher who chose the song over the girl, and a father who could only stand guard. Sunday, the centennial. They're going to sing it, and this time they're going to sing it to you. I'll go to the pastor. I've got the original in your hand, dated, signed. There's no argument. Junie, it's yours. It's been yours for 18 years. We put your name back on the song. I had never seen a person get more still than she got right then. She didn't reach for the logbook. She looked at the two mugs on the desk, hers with the crack and cormorant in worn gold, mine with the chip and the fisherman aiming too high, and she looked at them a long time, and when she finally spoke it was slow and flat and out loud, no rhythm to ride, each word set down alone like a stone. No, she said. Junie. No, she said again, and this one came out clean, no stutter at all, because she meant it all the way to the bottom. She took the logbook then, and she wrote, and she turned it around, and it was the longest thing she ever wrote me, and I have it still. If you stand up in front of that church and tell them the stuttering lot girl wrote their hymn, here's what happens. Half of them won't believe you. The other half will believe you and be embarrassed, and people who are embarrassed by you never forgive you for it. And every one of them forever will look at me on Sunday morning and think there's the poor thing who finally got her due. Isn't that nice? And I will be a story again. A different story, but a story. She pressed the pen so hard on the last line she nearly tore it, the way she'd torn the clef at 12. I have been a story my whole life. I would rather be nobody than be that. I read it twice. And then, because I am a man who fixes things and could not fix this one, I made the mistake I still think about. I said, then let me be the one to hold the pages. You don't have to say a word. I'll turn them for you, and you'll play, and I'll do the talking. I watched it happen. I watched the exact moment I lost her, and it wasn't a slam, it was worse. It was a softening. Something in her face went gentle and far away, the way a person looks when they've stopped arguing, because they've decided something you're not going to like. You'll do the talking, she said very quietly. You'll turn the pages, you'll answer for me. She nodded slowly to herself, not to me. That's the whole rest of my life, isn't it? Some good man doing my talking. She closed the logbook. I heard you, Theo, at the church. You put a floor under me so my own words would land. It was the kindest thing anyone ever did. Breath, and I have thought about it every night since, that I will always need the floor. That you will always be building it. And that's not wanting somebody. That's work. That's not. It's late, she said. You should go. It's a long drive back to Ash Street. And she opened her book and she looked down at it and she was gone. Right there in front of me, behind the desk, in the lamplight, 3 feet away. I went. I'd love to tell you I forced it, that I stayed and made her hear me, but that isn't how these things go with proud people, and it isn't how it went. She was too polite to fight and too decided to bend. Over the next few days, the desk got quiet in the specific way a house gets quiet. I'd stop by. She'd be kind. She'd write short. The logbook, which had filled up all spring with the fastest wit in Harlow, went to one-line answers and then to none. She started leaving the second mug in the cupboard. She'd only get one down. And she began very quietly to fold herself out of the way. It wasn't a dramatic thing. There was no midnight bag by the door. It came out in pieces, the way real leaving does. A cousin in Boot had a spare room, she mentioned, writing it small. There was transcription work you could do by mail now, medical files, court records. You typed all day and mailed it back and nobody ever needed you to say a word out loud. She'd already sent for the papers. It was practical. It was even smart. It was a woman arranging a life where her voice would never matter to anyone again, so that she could never again be anyone's floor to build, anyone's page to turn, anyone's chore dressed up as a choice. She wasn't running from me. She was trying out of something almost like tenderness to get out of my way before I found out how much of me she'd need. I reassembled her father's piano and set it right in every way I knew, and the week she started answering me in one word, the middle C began to stick again. It's just wood and weather, I know that. But I'd fixed that key 4 times, and it held every time the logbook was full, and the week the logbook went quiet, the C started hanging on again, holding the note a half beat past when I let it go, unwilling to quit, and I sat in my shop and listened to it do that and thought, yeah, me too. I don't want to let go either. So I retreated into what a certain kind of tired, decent man retreats into, which is respect. I told myself she'd been clear. I told myself the grown-up thing was to honor her choice. I told myself a lot of true things that added up to a lie, and the shop got gray, and the rain kept on, and the centennial came. The night before it, she came to me. I was in the shop late, because where else would I be? Wiping down her father's Baldwin with a rag I didn't need to be using, and the rain was coming down Ash Street in sheets, and there was a knock on the glass. I knew the shape of her before I got the light on. She was standing under the awning with no umbrella, soaked through, her cardigan buttoned all the way up like armor that had stopped working, and she'd walked, I found out later, the whole 11 blocks from the cormorant in it, because she couldn't ride out to say what she'd come to say, and she couldn't say it on paper. I opened the door. She didn't come in. She stood in the doorway with the rain behind her and the half-tuned uprights behind me, and she had the logbook under her arm wrapped in a plastic bag against the wet, and she didn't take it out. That's how I knew. "You'll get sick," I said. "Don't," she said. "Don't build me a floor. Not this time. I have to do this one from the ground." She was shaking from the cold or from the size of it, and she pressed her hand flat to her collarbone, the old gesture, holding the door. And then, deliberately, she took her hand away and let it hang at her side and made herself stand there with nothing to hold. "I practiced this. On the walk, I still don't have it right. I'm going to stutter through the whole thing, and you're going to have to let me." "I've got all night," I said. "Nobody's clock is running but mine." She almost broke on that. But she didn't. She looked at me across the doorsill with the rain roaring on the awning, and she said the truest sentence of her life, out loud in her own broken time, and I have never heard anything more beautiful in a life spent listening for beautiful things. "I don't know how to be wanted," she said. Breath, her jaw locked, and she waited it out, and I waited with her and did not fill it. "I know how to be needed, and how to be laughed at, and how to be left." Breath. "But wanted, I don't have I never learned the word for it." Her eyes were streaming and she let them. "I keep trying to leave before you can find out that I'll always be slower than you out loud. That I'll always need the floor. And I decided that was a gift I was giving you. Getting out of your way." She shook her head, hard water flying. "But I walked 11 blocks in the rain to give it to you and I couldn't. So it wasn't a gift. It was just me being a coward with better manners." I stepped into the doorway, into the cold coming off her, and I still didn't touch her, because she'd said do this from the ground, and I was going to let her have her feet under her. But I took my father's tuning fork out of my shirt pocket, the plain dull steel one, 440 honest vibrations a second, and I held it up between us in the rain light. "You know what this is," I said. "It's the one thing in any room that isn't lying. You strike it and it gives you the true note, and then you tune everything else to it, patient, one string at a time, and you don't rush it and you don't quit when it fights you." I struck it on my knee. It sang, thin and clear, under the rain. "You keep saying you'll always need the floor, Junie. I don't want to build you a floor. I want to tune to you. You're the true note. You've been the true note since the church, and I've been a half-step flat my whole life and never knew why, and it made me tired, and I didn't have a word for it either. My own voice went then, and I let it, fair's fair, let me tune to you. I've got a good ear and all the time there is." She looked at the fork singing in my hand, and then Junie Lott, who had spent 30 years handing people the hard thing first so they couldn't corner her with it, did the bravest thing I ever watched a person do, which was ask for something out loud with no floor under her at all. "Stay in the doorway with me a minute," she said. "I'm not ready to come in, but don't go." "I'm not going anywhere," I said. And she closed the 11 inches between us and kissed me in the doorway of my father's shop in the rain, cold-lipped and shaking and certain, the plastic-wrapped logbook pressed between us, and it was the only kiss in this whole story, so I'm going to leave it there, except to say that when it ended, she laughed, the real one, low, surprised out of her, and said, "I didn't stutter on that," and I said, "No consonants," and she laughed again, and I finally pulled her in out of the rain. She played the hymn under her own name at the centennial the next morning. Not because I talked her into it. Because sometime around 3 in the morning, wrapped in my father's work coat drinking bad shop coffee out of the fisherman mug, she'd said, "Slow, if you turn the pages, it's you doing my talking." Then she'd looked at the Baldwin. "But if I play it on his piano with you just turning paper, not answering for me, then it's not a story anymore. It's a song, with a player." She'd set the mug down. "I'll play. You turn. And when they ask, I'll tell them myself. However long it takes me, let them wait." So I hauled her father's upright to the church at dawn in the rain, the piano he'd stood guard over for 15 years, and I set it on the sanctuary floor. And when the pastor rose at the end of that 100-year service and said they'd now sing the hymn Silas Wren had left them, Junie Lott walked up out of the congregation, no microphone, nobody pulling her, and sat down at her father's piano, and I stood beside her to turn the pages of a pencil score a 12-year-old had pressed too hard on. And before she played a note, she looked out at the whole town that had decided what she was, and she made them wait, and in her own slow, unhurried, broken time, riding no rhythm but her own, she said, "My name is Junie Lott. I wrote this when I was 12. Breath, the room did a shift I'd never felt before. Not the lean of a crowd about to laugh, the stillness of a crowd that has just understood it was wrong about someone for a very long time. Mr. Wren taught me how. He kept it safe the only way he knew. Breath. My father kept it safe the only way he knew. Today I'm going to keep it myself." She put her hands on her father's keys. "It's called Morning on the Water. The river was here first. And the river doesn't rush." Then she played it on her father's piano, and I turned the pages, and when her right hand came down on the middle C, the note that had stuck for a month, the note that had been holding her secret behind it, the note I'd fixed 4 times and lost every time she went quiet, it rang out clean and true and let go exactly when she lifted her finger, at last done keeping what it had been keeping, free to be only a note. I heard it. I might have been the only one in that church who knew to listen for it. Middle C, true, released on time. The town cried again. Same old man, 3rd row, glasses off, but this time they were crying to her face and she let them, and she did not become a story. She became a woman at a piano who had finally been allowed to say her own name. We were married 4 months later in the shop among the half-tuned uprights on a wet Saturday because in Harlow they're all wet. Not a big thing. The pastor came. Petrie came and cried more than anyone. Dale Furlong did not come and no one missed the blazer. Junie wore gray and I wore my father's coat, and we said our vows short because she wanted to say hers out loud and I wanted the whole world to wait for them, and it did. Her father's Baldwin lives in our front room now, and the middle C has never stuck again. Not once, and I've stopped believing that's only wood and weather. The 2 mugs sit on the same shelf, and we both drink from the fisherman because she says the ugly one's already been through something and won't judge us. The pencil score hangs framed over the piano, Junie Lott, age 12, and under it, in a frame I made, the church's new hymnal page, which now reads in ink, words, and music by Junie Lott, arranged for the choir by Silas Wren. Because she decided the old man should keep something too, and that's the kind of thing she does. And the logbook is full again. We still write in it, some nights, at the kitchen table, even though she talks to me all the time now, out loud, in her own good time, and I've never once wished it faster. We write because it started us, and because some things you say better with a pen, and because my father's steel tuning fork sits in a dish beside that book, and every so often, when the world's gone a half-step flat and mean and doesn't know why, I strike it on my knee to remember what true sounds like. It sounds like her name, said slow, all the way to the end, by the woman who finally decided to keep it.